Deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to the hollows like a burial shroud and silence speaks louder than any scream, a family existed whose bloodline had turned against itself. This is the story of Martha May Collier, a woman whose womb became a tomb, whose children arrived into this world already marked by death. The year was 1947. World War II had ended, but in the remote valleys of Appalachia, time moved differently. For 5 generations, the Collier family had lived in the same hollow. Isolated by choice and geography. The nearest town, Harland, sat 23 miles away over treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during winter months. Rarely did the Colliers leave their land. They didn't need to. Within the boundaries of their ancestral property existed everything they required: a creek for water, fields for crops, and each other for companionship. Born in 1929 to Ezekiel and Sarah Collier, Martha May was the youngest of 7 children, though only 4 survived past infancy. Her childhood was marked by isolation and routine. The family spoke their own dialect, a strange mixture of Old English and invented words that outsiders found nearly incomprehensible. They attended no school. They saw no doctors. They knew only the mountain and each other. When Martha May turned 16 in 1945, her father arranged her union with her first cousin, Thomas Collier. In the hollow, this was not unusual. For generations, the Colliers had been intermarrying. Ezekiel himself had married his uncle's daughter. His own father before him had taken his niece's wife. Long ago, the family tree had stopped branching outward and instead had twisted back upon itself, roots tangling with branches until the whole structure became a knot of repeating names and shared blood. Thomas was 24, a quiet man with a pronounced limp and eyes that sat too far apart on his narrow skull. A cleft palate he was born with made his speech difficult to understand. Constantly, his hands trembled, a condition that worsened with age. But in the Collier family, these were simply the marks of their lineage, accepted as normal variations rather than warning signs of genetic collapse. Martha May and Thomas lived in a cabin built by Thomas's grandfather, a structure that leaned slightly to one side and let in cold air through gaps in the walls. The furniture was handmade, crude, but functional. A single fireplace provided heat and cooking capability. They had no electricity, no running water, no connection to the outside world except for rare trips to trade goods in town. In the spring of 1946, Martha May became pregnant. She was 17 years old. At first, the pregnancy proceeded normally, though she experienced severe nausea and fatigue that confined her to bed for weeks. Her mother, Sarah, attended to her with remedies passed down through generations, teas made from roots, poultices applied to her swelling belly, prayers whispered in the darkness. In January 1947, Martha May went into labor. The birth lasted 36 hours. No doctor was present, only Sarah and Thomas's mother, Rebecca. When the child finally emerged, the women fell silent. The infant, a boy they named Ezekiel Jr., was alive, but profoundly malformed. Misshapen was his head, elongated and compressed on one side. From their sockets, his eyes bulged, unable to close completely. His arms were twisted, the bones bent at unnatural angles. His skin had a grayish pore as though life had already begun to drain from him. The baby made no sound. He breathed in shallow, rapid gasps. With effort, his tiny chest heaved. For 3 days, Martha May held him, watching as he slowly faded. He never nursed. He never cried. On the 4th day, his breathing stopped. Behind the cabin, they buried him in ground so frozen they could barely break the earth. Within months came Martha May's second pregnancy. She conceived again in the summer of 1947, and by spring of 1948 she delivered another child. This one was a girl named Sarah after her grandmother. With more visible problems, little Sarah was born. Her spine curved severely, creating a hump on her back that made her body seem broken even in infancy. One of her legs was significantly shorter than the other, ending in a club foot. Her jaw protruded forward, preventing her mouth from closing properly. Drool constantly leaked from her lips, but unlike her brother, Sarah lived. Slowly, she grew, never reaching the developmental milestones that even the isolated Colliers recognized as normal. At 6 months, she could not lift her head. At 1 year, she made no attempts to sit up. Her eyes tracked movement, suggesting some level of awareness, but she never smiled, never made the cooing sounds of infancy. She simply existed, breathing and eating, but never truly living. As best they could, the family cared for her. Each day, Martha May spent hours feeding Sarah with a cloth soaked in milk, as the child could not coordinate the movements necessary to nurse. A special cradle that accommodated her twisted spine was carved by Thomas. They loved her in the way people love something broken that they feel responsible for protecting. In 1949, Martha May conceived for a third time. The pattern was establishing itself, though no one in the family had the knowledge to understand what was happening. The child born in early 1950 was another boy named Thomas Jr. He arrived with a head too large for his body, filled with fluid that caused the skull to expand grotesquely. To the sides of his head, his eyes were pushed by the pressure. His fontanelles, the soft spots on an infant's skull, never closed. Across his swollen head, the skin stretched thin, veins visible beneath like a road map of suffering. For 2 weeks, Thomas Jr. lived. From birth, his breathing was labored, his body unable to coordinate the basic functions of survival. He had seizures that contorted his small frame, his back arching until it seemed his spine might snap. Through each episode, Martha May held him, tears streaming down her face, praying to a God she had been taught cared for even the least of his creatures. When Thomas Jr. died, something broke in Martha May. She was 21 years old and had buried 2 children while caring for a third who would never grow beyond infancy. The other women in the hollow whispered that she was cursed, that she carried death in her womb. But the truth was far more mundane and far more terrifying. Chapter 2. The Pattern of Decay. By 1951, Martha May had given birth to 6 children. 3 were dead. Buried in the small cemetery behind the cabin where wooden crosses marked their brief passages through this world. Sarah, now 3 years old, had not grown or developed. She remained infant-sized, her body refusing to mature, trapped in a state of perpetual helplessness. 2 other children had been born in the intervening years, each carrying their own catalogue of deformities. The 4th child, a boy named Jacob, born in late 1950, had survived past infancy, but presented his own horrifying array of problems. From birth, his eyes were clouded with cataracts, rendering him functionally blind. His ears were malformed, small and set too low on his head, reducing his hearing to muffled approximations of sound. Most disturbingly, his jaw had failed to develop properly, leaving him with a mouth that could barely open, making feeding an agonizing process that took hours. The 5th child, a girl named Rebecca after Thomas's mother, arrived in 1951. She was born with her internal organs partially visible through a defect in her abdominal wall. Completely during development, the skin had failed to close, leaving a portion of her intestines exposed. The midwives had tried to cover the opening with cloth soaked in whiskey, hoping to prevent infection, but within days, the smell of rot had filled the cabin. For 11 days, Rebecca lived before her small body surrendered to infection and shock. Martha May's body was destroying itself. A heavier toll was taken with each pregnancy. Her teeth had begun to fall out, her gums receding and bleeding. Her hair thinned and fell in clumps. Dark circles ringed her eyes, which had taken on a hollow, haunted appearance. She was 22 years old, but looked 40. The mountain had aged her, or perhaps the children had, each one taking a piece of her youth, her health, her hope. With a helpless frustration that sometimes manifested as anger, Thomas watched his wife deteriorate. From dawn until dark, he worked the fields, trying to provide enough food for their growing household of damaged children. His own health was declining as well. To his arms and legs, the tremor in his hands had spread. With an increasingly pronounced shuffle, he walked. His speech, already difficult due to his cleft palate, became nearly incomprehensible as his facial muscles weakened. The other families in the hollow began to avoid the Colliers. When Martha May appeared in town for rare supply runs, people turned away, made excuses to cross the street. They saw her children, the ones who had survived, and recognized something fundamentally wrong, though they lacked the education to name it. These were superstitious people, prone to believing in curses and divine punishment. They wondered what sins the Colliers must have committed to be afflicted with such obvious evidence of wrongdoing. But the Colliers were not being punished by any god. They were being destroyed by mathematics, by the cold equations of genetics that care nothing for love or intention. Recessive genes are carried by every human. Mutations that are typically harmless when paired with a normal copy from the other parent. But when close relatives reproduce, dramatically increases the probability of two copies of these harmful recessive genes combining. In the Collier family, 5 generations of cousin marriages had created a genetic bottleneck. Through the bloodline, the same damaged genes circulated, appearing and reappearing with increasing frequency. With each generation, the genetic diversity decreased. With each intermarriage, the chances of devastating combinations increased. Martha May and Thomas were not just first cousins. They were the product of generations of intermarriage. So high was their genetic similarity that their children inherited matched pairs of mutated genes affecting bone development, neural tube formation, connective tissue strength, and countless other biological systems. In the winter of 1952, Martha May became pregnant for the 7th time. She was 23 years old. By this time, she had stopped hoping for a healthy child. She simply endured, moving through the days in a fog of exhaustion and resignation. Thomas had stopped touching her with any tenderness. Their coupling had become a grim duty performed in silence and darkness. From the start, the pregnancy was difficult. Throughout the first trimester, Martha May experienced bleeding. Disproportionately large, her belly swelled, and she could feel strange movements inside. Not the normal kicks and rolls of a developing fetus, but irregular thumps and shifts that felt wrong. Sarah, the family matriarch, prepared remedies and said prayers, but even she seemed to have lost faith in their effectiveness. In August 1952, Martha May went into labor prematurely. The birth was quick and violent. The child, another boy, emerged stillborn. His body was covered in thick, dark hair from head to toe, a condition called hypertrichosis that gave him an almost animal appearance. Along his back, his spine was exposed, the vertebrae visible through a gap in the skin. His internal organs had not developed properly. An autopsy, had one been performed, would have revealed kidneys that were fused together and lungs that had never fully formed. That same day, they buried him, adding another wooden cross to the growing cemetery. The burial was not attended by Martha May. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body empty and her mind numb. In some instinctive way that transcended education or formal knowledge, she had begun to understand that her womb had become a place where life went to die. Chapter 3. The Hollow Secret. The year 1953 brought no relief to the Collier family. Now 24, Martha May was pregnant again. This would be her 8th child. Sarah, now 5 years old, remained developmentally frozen at an infant stage, requiring constant care. Jacob, at 3, had learned to navigate his blind and deaf world through touch. But his jaw problems meant he could only consume liquids and soft foods painstakingly prepared by his mother. The newest addition to this collection of suffering was born in March 1953, a boy they named Daniel. He arrived with a condition that made him appear as though he had been partially melted. His facial features were asymmetrical to an extreme degree, with one side of his face drooping significantly lower than the other. His skull bones had not fused properly, leaving soft spots that pulsed visibly with his heartbeat. Most alarming was his breathing, a wet gurgling sound that suggested fluid in his lungs that his body could not clear. For 6 months, Daniel lived. During that time, Martha May barely slept, constantly monitoring his breathing, clearing his airway, trying to keep him alive through sheer force of will. When he finally died in September, she felt a guilty sense of relief mixed with her grief. She was exhausted beyond measure, running on instinct alone, caring for 3 severely disabled children while her body prepared to create another. The community's response to the Collier situation was complex and contradictory. On one hand, Christian charity demanded some level of assistance. Church members occasionally dropped off food or clothing, leaving items on the porch without knocking, avoiding direct contact. On the other hand, the visible evidence of the Collier situation created fear and revulsion. People spoke in whispers about what happened when families became too close, when the bloodline turned in on itself. An elderly woman named Mrs. Hester, who ran the general store in Harland, finally took action. In the fall of 1953, she contacted a circuit-riding doctor named Coleman, who visited remote communities several times a year. She described the Collier situation in terms that finally penetrated his professional detachment. He agreed to make a visit to their hollow. Dr. Coleman arrived at the Collier cabin in November 1953. He was 56 years old, a man who had seen poverty, neglect, and suffering throughout his career in Appalachia. But nothing had prepared him for what he found in that cabin. Sarah, now 5.5, lay in a cradle built for an infant. Her body twisted and underdeveloped, her eyes tracking him with an awareness that made his skin crawl. Jacob, blind and deaf, rocked back and forth in a corner, his malformed jaw giving his face a grotesque appearance. Another child, a girl born earlier that year, sat propped against a wall, her head lolling to one side, drool pooling on her dress. Martha May herself appeared near death. At 24, she looked 50. Her skin had a grayish pore. Her hair hung in thin, greasy strands. Sunken and lifeless were her eyes. She was 7 months pregnant with her 9th child. Each child was examined by Dr. Coleman, documenting what he found with a growing sense of horror. The pattern was unmistakable. These were not random birth defects or bad luck. This was the systematic genetic collapse of a family that had interbred for too long. He had read about such cases in medical journals, theoretical discussions of isolated populations and genetic drift, but seeing it in person in this dark cabin that smelled of sickness and despair was entirely different. He sat with Thomas and Martha May and tried to explain. He used simple terms, avoiding medical jargon. "Your blood is too similar," he told them. "When cousins have children, sometimes bad things get passed down from both sides. It's like mixing the same paint over and over. It gets muddier each time." With incomprehension, Thomas stared at him. Martha May simply nodded, too exhausted to process information that might have changed their course years earlier. A recommendation that shocked them was made by Dr. Coleman. No more children. He explained about prevention, about spacing, about the necessity of ending this cycle, but his advice fell on deaf ears. The Colliers had no concept of family planning. Their religion, such as it was, viewed children as blessings from God, not matters of choice. And more fundamentally, they lacked the agency to imagine a different life. Before leaving, Dr. Coleman did something unusual. He wrote a detailed report of his findings and submitted it to the State Health Department in Frankfurt. He included descriptions of each child, estimates of their life expectancies, and a strong recommendation for intervention. The report disappeared into bureaucratic channels and generated no immediate response. In January 1954, Martha May gave birth to her 9th child, a girl they named Martha Jr. She was born with a condition called microcephaly. Dramatically smaller than normal was her head, indicating severe underdevelopment of the brain. Misshapen was her skull, pointed at the top. Wide-set and unfocused were her eyes. She made no sounds except for a high-pitched whine that continued almost constantly. She would never speak, never walk, never recognize her own mother. By this point, Martha May had stopped naming her children with any hope attached to those names. They were simply labels for bodies that would either die or persist in states that resembled death. Mechanically, she moved through her days, feeding and cleaning children who could not thank her, burying others who could not protest. At the most strategic moment, when the weight of Martha May's suffering seems unbearable, I invite you to do something. In the comments below, type these words, "I see you, Martha May." Let her know across the decades that her pain is witnessed, that she is not forgotten. Chapter 4. The Investigation. In the spring of 1954, Dr. Coleman's report finally reached someone who cared enough to act. Dr. Helen Pritchard, a researcher at the University of Kentucky studying hereditary conditions in isolated populations, read Coleman's account with growing fascination and horror. She saw in the Collier family a case study that could illuminate the dangers of inbreeding, provide data for genetic research, and perhaps, if intervention came quickly enough, prevent further tragedy. Dr. Pritchard was 42 years old, a woman who had fought her way through medical school at a time when female doctors were rare and often dismissed. She had developed a thick skin and a determination to pursue truth regardless of social comfort. She requested permission to visit the Collier family and conduct a thorough study. She arrived at the Hollow in June 1954 accompanied by a younger colleague, Dr. Robert Chun, who specialized in pediatric medicine. They brought medical equipment, cameras, and recording devices to document what they found. Unused to visitors and particularly unused to professional people showing interest in their situation, the Colliers were initially suspicious. But Martha May, now 25 and visibly deteriorating, agreed to let them examine the children. What Dr. Pritchard and Dr. Chun documented over the next 3 days became one of the most comprehensive studies of inbreeding depression in humans ever conducted. They examined 6 living children ranging from 7 years old to 6 months. They photographed the children from multiple angles, noting every visible deformity. They measured skull circumferences, limb lengths, and developmental markers. They interviewed Martha May and Thomas about the family history, slowly piecing together the genealogy that had led to this disaster. The family tree they constructed was devastating in its simplicity. The Colliers had been intermarrying since at least 1847 when the first generation settled in the Hollow. Great-grandfather had married great-aunt. Grandfather had married his first cousin. Father had married his uncle's daughter. The same names appeared over and over. The genetic pool shrinking with each generation until it became a puddle rather than a pool. Dr. Pritchard calculated that Martha May and Thomas shared approximately 37.5% of their DNA, far higher than the 12.5% typical of first cousins due to the accumulated intermarriage in previous generations. This meant their children had a tremendously high probability of inheriting 2 copies of any harmful recessive gene present in the family line. The doctors identified at least 12 distinct genetic disorders present in the Collier children. Some conditions were well known: cleft palate, club foot, microcephaly. Others were rare syndromes, typically only seen in isolated populations or consanguineous marriages. Several children showed combinations of conditions that suggested multiple genetic mutations acting simultaneously. Most heartbreaking was the doctor's prognosis for the surviving children. Sarah, at 7, had the physical and mental development of a 3-month-old infant. She would never walk, talk, or live independently. Jacob's blindness and deafness combined with his jaw deformity meant he would require total care for life. The younger children showed even more severe impairments. Dr. Chun estimated that none of the children would survive beyond age 15, and most would die much younger. On the 3rd day of their visit, Dr. Pritchard sat with Martha May. She tried to explain in clear terms what had happened. "Your children are dying because of the family marriages," she said gently. "When relatives have children together, bad genes get doubled up. Your babies are born with things wrong that can't be fixed." With an expression that was difficult to read, Martha May listened. Exhaustion, resignation. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I've known since Sarah. I can feel it when they're growing inside me. Something's wrong from the start. But what am I supposed to do? This is my family. This is my husband. I can't just leave." And there was the heart of the tragedy. Martha May was trapped by geography, by culture, by poverty, by religion, by love, by duty. She could no more choose to leave than she could choose to stop breathing. The hollow was her entire world, and the rules of that world had been established long before her birth. A recommendation to the state authorities was made by Dr. Pritchard. The Collier children should be removed from the home and placed in specialized care facilities. Martha May should be provided with medical intervention to prevent future pregnancies. Thomas should receive counseling about the genetic dangers of their situation. The family should be relocated, if possible, to a community with more diversity and less isolation. None of these recommendations were implemented. The state lacked the resources and the political will to intervene in a remote family's private affairs. The Colliers had committed no crime. They were poor and isolated, but not actively neglectful. Their situation was tragic but not illegal. Removing children from their parents required evidence of abuse or immediate danger. And while the children's conditions were severe, they were being fed and sheltered to the best of the family's ability. In late June 1954, Dr. Pritchard left the hollow carrying boxes of documentation, photographs, and measurements. She published her findings in the Journal of Medical Genetics in early 1955 using pseudonyms to protect the family's identity. The article titled "Genetic Consequences of Extended Consanguinity in an Isolated Mountain Population" became a landmark study cited for decades by researchers studying the effects of inbreeding. But for Martha May, the study changed nothing. By the fall of 1954, she was pregnant again, with her 10th child. Chapter 5. The final chapter ***. Martha May Collier's 10th child was born in May 1955, another boy named Ezekiel III after the grandfather and the first dead son. He arrived with a condition that made Dr. Pritchard's documentation seem prophetic. So fragile were his bones that the birth process itself caused multiple fractures. Through his translucent skin, his ribs were visible, bent at angles that suggested they had broken and healed incorrectly while still in the womb. Soft was his skull, collapsing slightly under even gentle pressure. For 18 days, Ezekiel III lived. During that time, Martha May held him almost constantly, afraid that setting him down would cause further injury to his fragile body. She fed him drops of milk with an eyedropper, watched his shallow breathing, and waited for the inevitable end. When it came, she felt numb rather than grief-stricken. She had run out of tears years ago. A crisis in Martha May herself was brought by the child's death. At 26 years old, her body had been pregnant or recovering from pregnancy for nearly 10 consecutive years. She had carried 10 children, buried 5, and was caring for 5 severely disabled offspring who would never grow up, never leave home, never live normal lives. The physical toll was catastrophic. From repeated pregnancies and poor nutrition, her bones had weakened. Nearly gone were her teeth, making eating painful. Her uterus had begun to prolapse, causing constant pain and bleeding. In August 1955, Martha May collapsed while working in the garden. Thomas found her lying in the dirt, conscious but unable to rise. He carried her inside and sent word to Mrs. Hester at the general store, who contacted Dr. Coleman. The doctor arrived 2 days later, examined Martha May, and delivered a stark assessment. Her body was shutting down. Years of malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and the stress of caring for severely disabled children had pushed her beyond her limits. Dr. Coleman insisted she be taken to the hospital in Lexington, over 100 miles away. Thomas resisted at first, the cost, the distance, the disruption to the family, but the doctor was adamant. "If she stays here, she'll be dead within a month," he said bluntly. For 6 weeks, Martha May spent in the hospital. Doctors there treated her for severe anemia, malnutrition, infections, and the physical damage from repeated childbirth. They also took steps to ensure she would not become pregnant again, performing a procedure without fully explaining it to Martha May or seeking explicit consent, a decision that reflected both the paternalism of the era and genuine concern for her survival. When Martha May returned to the Hollow in October 1955, she found that one of her children had died in her absence. Martha Jr., born with microcephaly 16 months earlier, had succumbed to pneumonia. Next to her siblings in the growing cemetery, she was buried. At the grave site, Martha May stood and felt nothing. The capacity for grief had been used up. Slow decline rather than dramatic events was brought by the years that followed. Sarah died in 1958 at age 10, her body finally giving out after a decade of barely functioning. Jacob survived until 1961, dying at age 11 from complications related to his multiple conditions. The other children followed in succession, none reaching age 13. Each death was both a tragedy and a release from suffering for the children, a reduction in the overwhelming burden of care for Martha May. By 1965, all of Martha May's children were dead. 10 pregnancies had produced 10 children, and all 10 had either died in infancy or childhood. The wooden crosses behind the cabin marked the entirety of her reproductive life, a decade of pregnancy and loss that had consumed her youth and destroyed her health. Thomas died in 1967 at age 46. His body was worn out by years of hard labor and genetic conditions that had been slowly worsening throughout his life. For another 12 years, Martha May lived on alone in the hollow. She never remarried, never left the mountain. Neighbors occasionally checked on her, leaving food on the porch. She was seen rarely, a ghost haunting the place where her life had unfolded and ended while she still breathed. Dr. Helen Pritchard continued her research on isolated populations and genetic diseases. She often thought about Martha May Collier, the woman whose body had become a laboratory demonstrating the cruelest mathematics of human genetics. In 1972, she published a follow-up article tracking the outcomes of all 10 Collier children, providing empirical evidence of the devastating effects of sustained inbreeding over multiple generations. The article concluded with a call for public health interventions in isolated communities, genetic counseling, education about the dangers of consanguineous marriage, and medical support for families affected by hereditary conditions. In February 1979, Martha May Collier died at age 49. Her body was found by a postal worker making rounds in the hollow. She had been dead for several days. An autopsy revealed that she had died of heart failure, though the coroner noted that nearly every system in her body showed signs of advanced deterioration. In the small cemetery behind the cabin, she was buried, finally joining her children. 11 crosses stood in the clearing, marking 11 lives shaped and ended by the slow violence of genetic mathematics. The cabin itself was abandoned and eventually collapsed, returning to the mountain that had isolated the Colliers for so many generations. A cautionary tale in medical education became the story of Martha May Collier and her children. Used to teach genetics students about the concrete consequences of inbreeding depression. Her case appeared in textbooks, always with pseudonyms, always with clinical distance. But behind the graphs and statistics and genetic diagrams was a woman who had loved, suffered, and endured more than anyone should have to bear. In the decades since Martha May's death, tremendously has our understanding of genetics advanced. We can now identify specific genes responsible for many of the conditions that affected her children. We can test for genetic compatibility before pregnancy. We can intervene early with medical treatments that might have saved some of her children's lives. But for Martha May, living in an isolated hollow in mid-20th century Kentucky, none of these advances came in time. Her story reminds us that genetic science is not abstract. It plays out in real bodies, real lives, real suffering. The Collier family's tragedy was not inevitable. It was the result of isolation, poverty, lack of education, and cultural practices that prioritize tradition over health. Breaking these cycles requires more than scientific knowledge. It requires social change, economic opportunity, access to health care, and the will to reach isolated communities with resources and education. If you've watched until this point, you've witnessed one of the darkest chapters in the hidden history of inbreeding in America. If you're not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now, because we continue to uncover these forgotten stories that reveal the truth about genetic isolation and its devastating consequences. In the comments, I want you to write, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly appreciates these important historical accounts. Hit the like button if this story impacted you, and share this video with someone who needs to understand the real consequences of sustained consanguinity. These stories matter. These lives mattered. And Martha May Collier, the Appalachian mother of sorrow, deserves to be remembered not as a medical curiosity, but as a woman who endured more than anyone should ever have to face.